Hello, 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 guys. Welcome to this new edition of Mind Podcast. This is Aadit Kapadia coming to you on yet another weekday. We're doing two podcasts in the space of 72 hours for you. So, wherever you are, whatever day you're listening or watching to us, we are here. Like I promised, the last one with Chayak was on politics. Indian politics, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Kerala. So if you haven't watched that, pause this one and watch it, or watch this one and then go back to that one. But together on my second half of the weekend, on my cultural podcast, history podcast, on social issues, is with me today is Vishal Ganesan, an attorney and the man behind the fantastic Hindu History account on Twitter and Instagram. Hi, Vishal. Welcome to Mind Podcast.
Hi, Aadit. Thanks for having me.
So, to give our viewers and listeners a perspective, Hindu history is documenting the history of Hindus in America. It also looks at how it was covered in media, how it was covered in books, how it was covered by intellectuals, what was said then. And Vishal also tries to bring a perspective when we do this discussion about what it means right now. What difference have we seen now that the world is more of a global place? You still have internet going everywhere, so at the click of a button people can know about countries, civilizations, cultures. But has it changed? Right, in mainstream America, has our perspective changed? To decode that, Vishal is with us for the next 4 hours, because that's how long it'll take. But we'll try to package this in less than an hour. So Vishal was about to text me, 4 hours, are you kidding me? So but Vishal, over to you. So give us a little bit, what prompted you into this? Why Hindu history? Why not, why not call it something else? And I notice you use the old pronunciation of the word Hindu, Hindo. So a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me. I really appreciate the invitation. So yeah, I think it's a great place to start, because this is the most common question I get, which is, some people even ask me like indignantly, like, why are you spelling it like with the two O's? But, I did that for a very particular reason, which is that, it's not so much about the history of Hinduism or Hindus, like the people. It's really about this construct of the Hindu. It's a cultural construct. And the point I've been trying to kind of illustrate through my, the work and the archival work and these newspaper clips is that the kind of cultural engagement with the Hindu began in America, long before Indians and Hindus were here in any significant numbers. So, Americans had constructed this idea of what the Hindu was, what he believed, how he lived, based on these sorts of reports, commercial activity, trade between America and India, even, dispatches from the British Raj that had arrived in American newspapers, So they had all this access to information, and through that information, they were able to kind of construct this, they were able to create this construct of the Hindu that was, abstracted from the day-to-day life of actual Hindus in India. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of why I use the spelling the way I do. One of the disclaimers I put on the Instagram and the Twitter is that this isn't really about Hinduism in India or Hindus in India. It's an American story that I'm trying to tell.
Absolutely. And Mind Makers stands at that cusp, right? So I am born and raised in India, and so are my co-founders. And but we are based over here in US for the last decade and a half or a decade and a bit. And we do talk about Indian politics, we talk about American politics, and also talk about the Indic impact on American life, cultural way of life. And nothing typifies more like. One thing which bothers me is, first of all, for the first 50 years, half the people didn't know about what Swami Vivekananda said in the World Parliament of Religions in 1893. But there is that, and then there is this huge gap. And then you suddenly talk about the present, but there is a lot of things that happen in between. And even in 1893, Swami Vivekananda was not the only one there. His trip along with him was Veerchand Gandhi, who was a Jain. And I mean, being a Jain myself, I had no idea about who Veerchand Gandhi was. And then I found out that he actually not only went, he actually even funded Swami Vivekananda's trip. So it was fantastic what both of them accomplished. So how do you deal with this weird sort of connotation that we have this amazingly popular event in 1893 and then nothing for like 90 years in terms of historical conversations? So how do you amalgamate that?
Yeah. I would add to that and say, not only is there a big gap after that, but there's also a big gap before, right? And I think that's one of the of the narrative gaps that I've been trying to fill. Because I think the traditional narrative, like if you talk to Indian Americans today, like I think most people know about World Parliament, or they know that Swami Vivekananda came to America and gave this big speech in Chicago. But I think what people miss out on is the long historical cultural context that preceded that, right? Vivekananda and the whole Indian delegation, as you point out, right? There were a bunch of people who came and spoke, and I highly recommend, by the way, going and reading. You can find, I don't remember the guy's name now, but you can, there were comprehensive reports put together of the World Parliament, and they transcribed all the speeches that were given, so you can go and find this stuff pretty easily, unlike Google Books or whatever. But they were responding to a kind of a long history, right? They were speaking in a vacuum. So when they were speaking to this American audience, they were responding to a century almost of kind of preconceived notions and ideas that were already circulating in American popular culture, American intellectual culture. And so that's kind of the Swami Vivekananda is not really the beginning of the story. That's in a lot of ways the middle of the story. It's certainly a crux moment of. Sorry, my phone just fell over. It's certainly an important moment. It's certainly an important moment, and I would call it like an inflection point. He was a massively popular figure. He gave extensive lectures all over America. Obviously founded the Vedanta Society. So, things kind of went to a whole nother level following the World Parliament, but it wasn't the beginning. So I'm hoping that's one of the lessons people take from Hindu history.
Yeah, fascinating, very fascinating. So let's take a little bit sort of a departure from after 1893. What would you count as one of the most significant moments of Hindu history in America?
I'm kind of I'm going chronologically. So right now, I'm at in like the early 20th century, and I'll say that I think one of the themes I've picked up on, and I've been posting a lot on this topic, is following Swami Vivekananda, there was like kind of a stream of these prominent spiritual figures who are arriving in America. There was obviously Swami Abhedananda, who was part of the Vedanta Society. You had like Swami Ram, all these spiritual figures kind of following in Swami Vivekananda's footsteps. And, they were all part of a continuous tradition, and they were immensely popular cultural figures. I mean, you see a lot of consternation in the American newspapers in this period in the early 20th century about, how many adherents that these people were drawing, how many, the potential, threat of these swamis converting people. And so it is interesting to see the kind of cultural reaction to the success of a lot of these Vedanta Society spiritual figures in America. And, the other thing that's kind of interesting too is they weren't just, they were operating in cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and they were really drawing adherents from the cream of the crop of American society. They were, it was the urban elite that was really being drawn to this kind of spiritualism and Vedanta and things of this nature.
So, because in the perspective of the Judeo-Christian worldview of America, right, Hinduism was seen as this sort of the hipster religion, where all these young hippies or something of the cities, and it didn't help that you had the whole Osho phase in Oregon, which was basically that going on, that these are these free love kind of crowd or something. And I'm painting this with a very broad brush, and I don't mean this in an insulting or any fashion. This is just from pure analytical perspective. This is how most Americans saw it. Most of the old school Americans saw it. But that perspective is slowly changing. And I find that the religious Americans, are probably finding a little common ground in the religious aspect of not common ground with Hinduism, but with the perspective of a lot of people who find Hinduism, because they find that most people, when you go to India, aren't the same people who are following Hinduism in America in the 50s, 60s, 70s, so forth.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. I think the other, this is a very interesting question, and it's certainly a trend that I think is worth kind of analyzing. It's if you look at the newspaper clips I'm in this period now in the early 20th century, yoga, when it first arrived in America, also caused a lot of consternation among establishment kind of Christian authorities. They saw especially women doing yoga as a very dangerous thing, because it was kind of the gateway to heathen religion and the gateway to paganism. And to see where we are now, where yoga, mindfulness, all of these, like these are ubiquitous in American society, and they're, you know, not only ubiquitous culturally, but economically, they're massive industries. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you know, like if you look at the trends in American society, I mean, you know, the way we measure it, right, by like church attendance, you know, the kind of story is that we're secularizing very rapidly, like church attendance is down dramatically. But I think, you know, the mistake that we need to avoid is to say that as a result, people are becoming less religious. Like, I don't think that's true. Like, I think the religious tendency is kind of persistent in human society. It just takes different forms. And so, you know, the question is what's going to fill that void? And I think we're seeing that, you know, like whether it's yoga, mindfulness, even, you know, astrology, especially among Gen Z, like it's kind of remarkable. You know, I now that I'm on Instagram with this Hindu history, like I see this a lot more prominently, but like astrology has kind of taken on this whole new, you know, popular culture, like prominence. And, you know, it coming from a Hindu background, that's kind of interesting to see, because that's kind of just like also like a ubiquitous part of Hindu culture, right? So yeah, I mean, it is interesting to think about how you know, various aspects of Hindu culture and Hindu religion are kind of filtering into the American public consciousness as a kind of the Christian, Judeo-Christian culture in America slowly you know, breaks down.
Yeah, no, and I very funnily say that from psychological fear, now we are moving to Hinduism in the psyche, right? Because you will find more Americans doing yoga and eating Indian food in a week than you probably would have found 5 years ago. I mean, it's exponentially increasing, right? And it's not just just you have Hinduism as that, just the soft power. Like you go to Whole Foods, right? You see now everyone warming up to turmeric, ghee, so many things. My friend who was born and raised here, one of my friends, she always jokes with me saying, "Where the hell were these people when 10 years ago all these people were laughing at what I took to school in my lunchbox?" And that was like 15 years ago, you know. And that is so true, right? I mean, that's how far we've come in 15 years, where people will be like, "Oh, what is this clarified butter thing?" Or saying, "Oh, I put ghee on my toast every day." So it's amazing.
Yeah.
So let's come to the pop culture part of it, right? How do you view how Hinduism is perceived today in the American perspective? Is it the same way as it was 30 years ago, or has it changed?
No, I mean, I think it's changed, but you know, it's tough because I don't think that there's a, you know, it's a complicated question, because I think there's still, like, you know, we often, you know, the fact that we're so globalized as a culture, and, you know, we have access to all this information, I think it sometimes will create the false impression that, you know, the threat is that it creates like a false impression of understanding, right? Which is like, we have to keep in mind, like, these are still two very different cultures, you know, and as there's an ongoing dialogue that, you know, that's going on between obviously American culture and Indian culture, but there's still a lot of kind of, you know, lost in translation, as it were. So, you know, I think that, you know, as much of as much progress as there's been made when it comes to like kind of cultural cross connections in this regard, there's certainly a lot of you know, scope for misunderstanding still, and, you know, that really comes through in the newspaper clips too, you know, because it's like, and this is, I mean, one of the underlying motivations of Hindu history, right, is I think one thing that's important for us to be cognizant of as we try to build these cultural bridges and create a cultural dialogue is that we're not operating on a blank canvas, you know. Like, I think if you start from the very beginning of you know, the kind of Hindu history, and this is one of the points I made in this Clubhouse discussion I hosted the other day, but, you know, there's basically like a dual track of you know, you have like the popular understanding, and then you have this kind of elite intellectual track, right? And these kind of operate in parallel, and they operate, sometimes they're intertwined, and they're in dialogue with each other. But, you know, these are kind of long-standing narratives that are deeply embedded in the culture at various levels. And so, you know, when you're trying to build these cultural bridges, you have to keep in mind that you're operating with this background. Like, you're operating with these ideas that pre-exist, and these preconceived notions that are already you know, existing in society, and you have to kind of you have to keep those in mind. And I think that's sometimes you know, lost on us. So I'm hoping,
No, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you short. Complete your point.
No, that's it. I just think it's important to kind of understand the context and
Yeah.
understand the background, and then operate with that in mind. Lest things be misunderstood.
No, because one thing that always strikes me is that when you talk about Hinduism, and there's this urge in a lot of sort of the liberals right now to put all religions in the same bracket, or like have this one thing and try. And some might be doing it just out of nobility. Let me find out what are the similarities and things like that. But if you apply them to the modern construct, it cannot work, right? Like there is a lot of debate about the gender issues in Islam or Christianity or so forth. But in Hinduism, it takes a whole different perspective that 9 days a year during Navratri, everything is
Yeah.
done around, the veneration of a goddess. The concept of, we say Ma Durga, Makari, it's as you revere your mother, that is how you revere the
Yeah.
goddesses, right? Saraswati Devi. So, you cannot view it in the same construct as people who are talking about Christianity or Islam. And I'm not comparing anything. I'm just saying that there is this natural urge, because we are more globalized, we are a little homogenized as well as societies in certain companies, especially people who don't consider them, like people who might consider themselves to be agnostics or atheists, right? So how do you address that issue, that Hinduism
Yeah.
is fundamentally different in many ways, and whether you agree or disagree, that's what we have to debate.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you hit at the core issue, and it's something I think about a lot. And it's, if I were to say that was like the defining issue for American Hindus today, it would be this one. And it's I think a category error that not only people on the outside, suffer from, but also Hindus themselves kind of fall for it too. And ultimately, if you're coming from a non-Hindu perspective, right, and you think about like what is your cognitive model for what a religion is, like clearly it's gonna be Christianity or Islam or Judaism, right? This is sort of what when you think of what a religion is, you think like, okay, well, there's a founder, there's some sort of sacred text. This text gives people like certain rules and beliefs that define them as a religious community, and this is what kind of defines a religion, right? It's a sort of a closed system, but is dynamic within certain framework. And I think often when people on the outside are trying to understand Hinduism, they apply the same model. So they kind of assume that it must follow the same kind of, format. And that's just not true, right? I mean, it's like you said, that model doesn't apply. And I think, sometimes Hindus themselves, especially when you hear critiques that you feel like are not consistent with your own understanding or consistent with your own beliefs, you kind of respond on the same terms. And that can also be a mistake, right? Because if you respond on those terms, and you're kind of putting the religion or putting your belief system in a box that it doesn't really fit into. So it's a serious issue that I think has implications for both sets of people. And I think I had a Twitter thread on this. I had a Twitter thread on this a while back that I stupidly deleted. I've been meaning to write a longer piece on this, but there's a wonderful Egyptologist named John Osman who writes about this. He writes about like the transition from kind of primary religions to secondary religions. He focuses on Egypt, but he has this kind of framework that I found very helpful to think about this question, which is the distinction between primary and secondary religions. And a primary religion is like it evolves organically over a long period of time. It's often inextricably tied in with a particular language, and it's often polytheistic, and it kind of has like a whole cosmology built into it. So examples would be like the Egyptian polytheism, Greco-Roman polytheism. Obviously, Hinduism is a primary religion. And then he contrasts that with secondary religions, right? Secondary religions are also described as counter religions. And these religions arise out of primary religions, and they have a distinct founder, they have a specific text. And they're also made to transcend geographic and ethnic boundaries, so they can easily be transplanted from one context to another. And I think a lot of the challenges that we face as American Hindus today are our inability to or so far our failure thus far to really come to terms with this, right? Like ultimately, Hinduism is not built to be transmitted in the same way that like a Christianity or an Islam is, right? Like it's not once it's pulled out of its so-called native cultural context, it's like there's a lot is lost in that movement, right? And I think, this is why there's so much kind of confusion among American Hindus today about like, well, what can be fairly said to represent, Hindu beliefs or Hindu views. And ultimately, like, this points to another fact, which is that we're not really a community of belief, right? I mean, if you think about like a Christian community or a Muslim community, like most Christians, there's probably some denominational differences, but if you talk to like most Protestants, they'll be able to tell you like, okay, here are like the core beliefs that unite us, despite, there might be some doctrinal or denominational conflict, but for the most part, there's like a set of core beliefs that unite Protestant Christians or Catholics or Muslims. I don't, that's not really true for Hindus outside of a kind of a broader metaphysical sense, right? Like most Hindus will believe in reincarnation, believe in karma. But outside of these kind of core metaphysical beliefs, there's not really a lot day to day that unites Hindus in terms of their beliefs, right? Like people worship different gods, people do different rituals. So there's so much internal diversity that it's very hard to describe Hindus as a religious community in the same way.
Yeah, yet there is this incredible situation where someone from Kerala, Adi Shankara, goes and in Kashmir, and the people, and so you do have that syncretic identity of Bharata that binds Kashmir with Kanyakumari and Dwarika with Assam.
For sure, it's a ritual community, right? It's a community joined by a shared ritual culture, like, and that's absolutely true. And I think the problem is for American Hindus, like a lot of that shared ritual community has been lost, right? Because I think. In India, especially, like, this Diana Eck, I'm sure you've heard, she's like a Harvard divinity scholar, and she wrote this wonderful book called India, Sacred Geography. And she talks about this in detail about how India was kind of the cultural unity you're referring to was built up through these kind of pilgrimage routes, right? So you had people from all over India that would travel to these different sacred pilgrimage sites, whether they were natural landmarks or whether they were temples. And often, temples were built on certain sacred natural landmarks that were considered important for particular divinities. They were built into this sort of like mythological framework. And so, this is what created this kind of cultural unity, even, if people had different beliefs and, but coming to America, like that's not present here, right? So that it poses a whole new set of challenges.
Yeah, no. And I think the American perspective is also, and apologies, people, if you're picking up the phone line behind me. But the American perspective is also very interesting because Hinduism is also just seen as a religion of the father or the mother of the parent, right? A lot of Hindu kids just view Hinduism as religion. So how do you solve that dichotomy of and I don't mean the people like you and I or something might be different. I'm talking about people who are not connected to it culturally. So and then that probably could be 30-40% of the American Hindu youth. So how would you change that perspective? How do you get them to own their religion, so to speak? Or I have debate about it. If you don't agree with it, that's the beauty, right? You can come and disagree and say that I don't agree, and someone will tell you why they might be wrong, they might be right, whatever. So how do you resolve this?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and this is exactly the kind of discussion that I think everyone needs to be having. I think temples should be discussing this more actively. But I think you have to go to the at the end of the day, like people are not going to they're not going to identify with, and they're not going to nurture a religion that doesn't speak to their kind of day-to-day needs and anxieties living in America, right? So I think what happens is this is just speaking from personal experience, and also this is this is my observations. But I think one of the issues is that when a lot of the kind of Indian immigration to America post 1965, what happened was people came to various communities throughout the country, and they kind of just set up temples that were kind of provincial, right? I mean, the way Indian immigration works is like you had one family that came in, and then they talked to all of their friends and family back in India, and then they would all start congregating in particular areas, right? So you started getting these communities that were relatively provincial, that reflected their community ties back in India, and and a lot of the religious institutions they created were reflected those same kind of traditions they grew up with. And I think there's a need to fundamentally rethink that. At the end of the day, the basis for kind of Hinduism in America can't simply be we're just going to keep carrying on the traditions of our parents and their parents, because
Yeah.
again we're removed from that cultural context, right? And
Yeah.
a lot of what sustained those traditions in India was the fact that they were part of this broader cultural
So they
idiom,
were tied
this
to a
broader cultural
geographic
context.
identity.
Yes, exactly. It was tied to a geographic identity, and that's just not present here. And I think for that reason, a lot of younger Hindus in America feel alienated from those traditions. So I think that there's a need to kind of fundamentally rethink like how we approach this question in America. And I think it does call for some pretty fundamental reform. And I think that you can this is not like we're starting from scratch, right? I mean, if you look at it, one of the things that I've been kind of interested in lately is, there is you're seeing this kind of parallel development of a whole, uniquely American strain of Hinduism, right? Particularly like in ISKCON, if you look at ISKCON, like they've kind of developed, an American brand of Hinduism that is like almost developing in total parallel to Indian American Hinduism. Like they have I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's like a whole host now of like a white American like kirtan singers that they have like bhajan albums that they release, and they do like concerts and stuff. Like it's very interesting to see because they're approaching this from the perspective that I think we need to approach it from, right? Which is like how do we appeal to the average American rather than what is the tradition that was followed in India centuries ago, and how do we continue that here? Like I think we have to learn a lot from the kind of American folks who are trying to build a sort of Hinduism that's emergent from an American cultural and social context. I think that's really the perspective we need to approach it from, because I just don't think that one of the thought experiments I often give my peers, like I was born here, I'm 32 now, and a lot of my peers, like people who are culturally and religiously aware and curious, and are interested in carrying forward Hindu traditions. I asked them, like, if we were to cut off Indian immigration to America today, and your community temple, like you were put in a place where you had to manage it, like let's say everyone retires and they have to bring in a new generation to manage these temples, like how many of us would actually feel competent enough to do that? Like I certainly wouldn't feel competent enough to do that. And I honestly, I don't know a single one of my kind of peers who would be qualified to do that, just because like we don't have the kind of deep knowledge of like the intricacies behind the different rituals behind just we don't have the knowledge of Sanskrit, like the technical knowledge is missing.
And let's face it, not just technical knowledge, even there needs to be a perspective on the belief system, right? Like, I mean, I'll be turning 32 as well in a couple of months. And I was born and raised in India, like so I have that sort of in the middle, right? Because I've spent almost a little bit of time here, a little bit of time there, most of my time in India, and a little more here. What strikes me is people in our generation, they might not agree with the same beliefs as well, and it's not coming from a position of sort of perspective or thing. A lot of it is coming from a position of ignorance, because we certainly we somehow, because we couldn't get a clear answer from people in our house or something. I mean, if people, they just assume that everyone out there doesn't have an answer, but that's not true. People in our house might know something, people outside might know something more, outside might know something less, and people in our house might know something more. So that dichotomy needs to be resolved, and only when we wholeheartedly welcome, and also have the ability of question after reading about it. See, if you question something without reading about it, then that's just dumb, right? I mean, you don't know enough and you are questioning it. But when you question after you've read in depth, and I'm not saying go and become a scholar of all the Puranas in Sanskrit, I'm saying at least have a cursory understanding of what is happening, and then start asking questions. So that's what
I absolutely agree. And I think this is a fundamental. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, that I was coming to you. Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say. I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and I think this is a fundamental tension that we have to resolve, right? Like, I think that people from like dharmic traditions generally, we're very proud of the kind of diversity of thought, and like this, we're very reluctant to kind of impose beliefs and say like this is what you have to believe, and this is we really I think it's a culture of seeking, right? Like this is very critical to the Dharmic tradition, is this idea that like the spiritual path is fundamentally an individualistic one, and you kind of choose the path that is best suited to your own nature. But I think that if you're trying to solve a pragmatic problem of building of maintaining this dharmic thought and dharmic traditions in America, I think you have to be a little bit more practical, and you have to kind of try to strike a balance between simplifying but also maintaining that culture of critical reading and questioning. And
Yeah.
I think now where the pendulum is too far on the side of just like anything goes, because I mean this is a problem, right? I mean if you're just like an American Hindu and you're in college or you're in school and you have people telling you like, oh, like this is what you believe, if you don't define your own beliefs, then other people are going to define them for you, and they're going to define them for you in a way that is not consistent with your understanding or your interests, right? So like I think there has to be, and this is not individual action here is important, but ultimately I think the answer here is institutional. Like I think temples, community organizations have to get together in a room and think seriously about like, look, like the status quo is not, the status quo is not working. And I think that unless there's some sort of like radical change or radical reform, like the alienation that especially like Indian Americans are feeling from their, traditions, like it's, I mean, I would say it's already a pretty, the high level of alienation, but I think it'll reach a critical stage if nothing has changed soon, so I think there really has to be like a serious rethinking from a fundamental level.
So it's interesting, and in the second and the final concluding part of the podcast, I wanted to focus a little bit on the specific instances that Vishal talks about, right? And when he talks about defining, I'm going to quote something from what he posted, I think two days ago or so forth. I forget when, 4 days ago. Sorry. So it was a piece, an essay by Mabel Potter Daggett. Called The Heathen Invasion of America. And I'm going to read out a couple of excerpts and get Vishal. Vishal already knows what I'm going to read out. So he's about to get up here, right? Yoga, the Eastern philosophy, the emblem of which is the coiled serpent, is being disseminated in America. Literally, yoga means path that leads to wisdom. Actually, it's proving the way that it leads to domestic infelicity, and insanity and death. And then it was in the Congress of Religions in 1893, they arrived silken-clad and sandal-shod to prove an attraction that outshone the plain American variety of minister in a frock coat and a white tie. The yoga class is like the Browning class of the Shakespeare class, a direct mean by which a Swami reaches the public. And I think that's what bothered them, because in a way, yoga was exactly what the conservatives of America liked, because it was very local. There was no nationalized yoga policy, right? You have a very fundamental class of like 20, almost like what they do in their churches, where you have a parish and 40, 50 people show up. And they were scared that what if, and yoga doesn't impose Hinduism on you, right? It is a very Hindu practice, but it does not impose a religion, and that's what scared them, that there is no, the freeness of it all, right? And you can see that, and this was in 1940s. It's unbelievable. So can you tell a little bit about more about
it's
this?
Really I mean that was probably one of my favorite clips that I found so far, and it's certainly representative of this the fear that you see like in the early 20th century when you saw these swamis drawing all these adherents, and like it was like the quote about the silk clad and sandal shod. I love that, but sandal shod.
That's what
it is kind of amazing, right? I mean, like, and sorry, what was that?
No, they said something might lead to infelicity, insanity, and death.
Yoga. Yeah, I love that. Yoga leading to insanity and death. Yeah, I mean, it's like it is. It's this is the kind of ebb and flow of one of the recurring themes throughout the Hindu history, right? Is that you have, and I mentioned this earlier, is that although you had a lot of these kind of the popular narrative was quite hostile to Hindu culture and beliefs. There was always this sort of elite this counter narrative, right? Which is that, you had, especially once the Asiatic Society started releasing English translations of various Sanskrit texts, and those were slowly making their way to America, right? So you had figures like Thoreau and Emerson, who were pretty steeped in Hindu spiritual tradition and then philosophical thought, and and this obviously it reaches a greater fruition through the Vedanta Society. But it is super interesting to see how, like, as the kind of popularity of these ideas increases, especially in the beginning of the 20th century, the reaction becomes, I mean, it's kind of amusing, but it's also like a little bit terrifying, right? I mean, like, these people were really seemed threatened by the spread of these ideas. And one of the interesting things about that essay is that she says yoga, she says, like, yoga might look harmless enough, right? It's just like these exercises, but she says it's just a gateway to pagan religion and a gateway to heathenry. And I found that quite amusing. But it does reflect a historic fear that really did exist. In American in that you see in American newspapers and these kind of missionary reports from a very early stage.
Yeah, and I was looking at the articles about Banaras and stuff. Like Frank Carpenter says that he has not seen idolatry so repulsive as it is in India. The gods of the Hindus represent the worst and the best elements of humanity. They're the gods of destruction rather than creation. What nonsense. I mean, if you have destruction and creation and preserver all in the pantheon of Hindu gods. So it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And if you thought, but here is what bothers me. That this came from a position of, and I'm not justifying it, it was a terrible pieces and stuff. But when I see New York Times and Washington Post, right, I still don't see some perspectives that have changed. So how would you, people who are saying that 120 years later, if we're doing the same thing, how have we progressed and what needs to change and how does that change happen?
Yeah, so I mean, this is an important point, and that's something that I think one of the central lessons I've learned from the Hindu history, right, is that, like, these narratives took hold in American society very early, right? Very early, as in like early 19th century, when Claudius Buchanan, he's kind of one of the central figures of the Hindu history story. He was a Scottish missionary who was active in India, and he was a very vivid writer, and he published these reports in missionary journals. And then those reports were subsequently published in American newspapers. And he was famous for, the juggernaut is the term that we have now. But, this was an anglicized version of the Jagannath, right? Jagannath Yatra. And the juggernaut became like the dominant image in the American cultural imagination of Hindus, right? Which is this like demonic idol on this giant cart. And like there was human sacrifice. I mean, it really is like the Temple of Doom. If you watch the Indiana Jones movie, like that, the imagery in Temple of Doom, like it didn't come out of nowhere. Like that the Temple of Doom, which, by the way, I mean, I love Indiana Jones. Don't get me wrong, but the imagery in that movie was tapping into preconceived ideas that Americans had.
Where they cut up monkey blood and all sorts of nonsense.
Yeah, monkey brains. But the idea was that imagery was tapping into a deeply embedded cultural prejudice that was existing in American society for centuries, right? It wasn't just like an invention. So, I think that and the way this is sustained, right, is like the cultural prejudice is embedded in the American imagination. And then you just have like a constant reporting of facts that support that narrative, right? So, one of the interesting things in the Hindu history, in the period of time that I'm in right now, in the early 20th century, is you start seeing a lot more activity from Indians in America. Like a lot of Baba Bharati is one of the characters that I have posted quite a few clips about him. But he was like a journalist in India. He actually like had some association with Kipling. I think he worked in the same newsroom as Kipling. But he eventually gave up his journalism, and he kind of, I guess, took some sort of sannyas and decided to come to America as a Hindu missionary. And he wrote prolifically. So a lot of these newspapers, include columns by Baba Bharati, and he's like, not until I came to America did I hear about Hindu women throwing their infants in the Ganges, or not until I came to America did I hear about people throwing themselves under the wheels of the Juggernaut, and his mission was to kind of, tell people like, no, this is not fact. These are just stereotypes that have been perpetuated over, decades. And it's interesting to see, like, he'd write these columns, and then there would be responses from American missionaries saying, like, oh, actually, I did see X, Y, and Z. So
Exactly.
I do think that that kind of basic pattern we still see today, right? And I see this play out on social media all the time, where the New York Times will post or the Washington Post will publish some article, and then you'll have a bunch of people in India on Twitter saying, like, this is just distortions and selective reporting of facts. And the thing that I think the takeaway message for me has been, like, this is not new. Like, this has been a fight going on for literally a century. This controlling the image of India and the American imagination has been a very fraught affair throughout American history. And I certainly, it is important to kind of understand that, like, the cultural attitudes that were formed, like, they don't just disappear, like, they are still present today. I think maybe Americans or Indians in America, maybe we don't, it's hard for us to kind of understand this because, I think, we are tend to be like middle class, upper middle class, and, our friend groups and our associates tend to be like, progressive Americans who are, pride themselves on their tolerance and stuff like this. But, there's, you have to realize that, like, it's a big country, and, like, these attitudes kind of seep pretty deep into the cultural fabric. So.
Yeah, no, and the progressivism also is fraught in a very Judeo-Christian perspective, right? That progressivism is also opposing to certain Christian values which were there, and the Hindu values they were in opposition to those values even 100 years ago, right? So there is that perspective also.
Yeah.
Also, I think a lot of this perspective also tends. The problem is, in American social construct, everything has become political because the American political system is so binary. People are viewing everything across as binary. But now the election is over, and I don't see that attitude changing even when the election is over. We're what, 3 months away, 4 months after the election, and people are still viewing as things in binary. Because especially when it comes to cultural issues, cultural context, what Hindus might think in one state, the Hindus of Florida and the Hindus of Texas and the Hindus of New York might be thinking in different perspectives, and that's how it should be, right? Because where you are, what are the issues you should bother, right? And I don't understand, like, how to get the twain together.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, I think this goes back to that core question, right? I mean, at the end of the day, like, it's very hard. Like, I don't, even when we talk about, like, the American Hindus, like, I don't even know if that's a coherent category, really, right? Because, like, what is it referring to? Like, what is underlying that descriptor? Like, we use the term Hindu in America, and it's just like, okay, well, if you were to describe the American Hindus, like the average American Hindu, like, what does he or she believe? I think that's the fundamental problem, and I think until we're willing to confront that issue and kind of talk about, like, a serious reform, and this is why I'm a big proponent of, I think ultimately, the conversation we need to have is, what is the kind of underlying philosophical core of Dharma, or what we call Hinduism? Like, what is that? Like, what is that? Because that's ultimately what we're trying to preserve, right? That's like the mission, right? Is like, what is this, the philosophical core of the Dharmic traditions that we believe the world needs, right? That we want to preserve in our own lives, and that we think that is good for the world. And, once you've kind of defined that, then the question becomes, well, okay, in America, what is the best way to advance that? What is the best way to preserve it? What is the best way to convince young Hindus that it's worth preserving? And how do we persuade other Americans that this is, like, something that's good for them and good for society? I think sometimes we miss the forest for the trees, and we focus too much on the details and lose sight of what really matters. So, I think for sure it's very hard to speak about currently. I think it's very hard to speak about American Hindus as a coherent category, just because we don't have the core set of beliefs that inform our lives day to day.
And also not take the Hinduism as what you see on Netflix TV shows, guys. It's a lot deeper than that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's exactly the thing, right? Like, how.
Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just gonna say, like, this is exactly the issue, right? Like, unless we can organize and advocate on our own behalf, and kind of speak from a place of authority, like unless we can, from an institutional perspective, define our beliefs and also like create the institutions that can control knowledge production. One of the things that like it's a very basic issue, but like if you one of the problems I think for our community is that you often find Hindu Americans in prominent positions who will make these like grandiose claims on behalf of Hindu Americans, right? And say like, oh well, like Hindus believe this, but it's like who says that? Like who's the authority there? Like who like there we have no. The problem is that we don't have an institutional mechanism by which to regulate that kind of knowledge production, right? I mean, you can look at the Catholic Church as an example, right? Like how do Catholics determine like what is the quote unquote Catholic view on a particular social or political issue? Well, there's like a whole bureaucracy that handles this, right? Like the Pope issues like encyclicals. Will write these long essays about whether it's like environmental issues or other moral issues, and then you have the churches are kind of integrated into this bureaucratic mechanism that kind of determines based on like fixed doctrine, right? The catechism. Based on this fixed doctrine, they kind of apply that to contemporary issues. And, as Hindus, we don't have that. It's kind of up to the individual, right? Like we have kind of these broad philosophical principles that unify us. And it's up to you to kind of take those broad philosophical principles and apply them to everyday issues or political issues. The problem is, that's a very fraught process and it's very complicated. And it basically gives a lot of space for opportunists to just say like, this is the Hindu view. Because it's not necessarily because this is like a well-considered position in the interest of the community, but it's in their own individual interest to kind of give a position that legitimacy. So yeah, I mean, to me, this is just another symptom of kind of the deep institutional crisis that we face, and I think that's really what our focus should be on addressing.
Absolutely. Fantastic point. And before we get into closure, so what we do in closing is we get recommendations for our listeners to read, write. Well, I mean, everyone I think should write, but to read and watch and what they should be watching or what they should be reading. It could be non-political. Usually we go even out of convention. We even talk about films or books or something like that. So, I want to talk to you, Vishal. Any recommendations you have for our listeners and viewers this time?
Well, I think two books that, just based on the topics that we've been discussing today that have been very influential for me. I mean, on the Hindu history side, Michael Altman, he's a professor of religion in Alabama, and he wrote the book Heathen, Hindu. Highly recommend it. If you're interested in this Hindu history topic, like he's kind of been my guiding light just in, I was finding all these newspaper clips and I didn't really know what to do with them. And then I kind of came across his book and I realized like, okay, there's actually like a model here, right? There's like there's an intellectual framework that I can plug into. So I highly recommend reading his book. Also Jeffrey Long, Professor Jeffrey Long, Hinduism in America. Very great, very good book, very interesting. And also, Dr. Radhakrishnan's A Hindu View of Life. That book I've been reading, I kind of refer to it consistently, and it's, in thinking about kind of like Hinduism in America, that's also been a very important book for me. He's obviously one of the greatest Indian philosophers, and he is very much like it's a very inspiring book to read, and I think his view on what Hinduism is and what Dharmic traditions are is very compelling. Like this idea that if a tradition is not living, it's a fossil. That's always a kind of a motto to keep in mind.
So I'm glad you talked about Dr. Jeffrey Long, he's a professor of religion in Pennsylvania, and he's also a columnist for us at Mindmakers. He has written 5 columns for us, 5 to 6 columns, and very good friend of ours at Mindmakers. And we probably are hoping of doing another podcast with him as well. He actually has written 2 pieces. One is about Jainism, an introduction. So all my fellow Jains who haven't read, I would recommend that. And then the historical dictionary of Hinduism as well.
Yeah, we should see if he's on Clubhouse, because he'd be a great person, I think, to have a Clubhouse discussion with,
Maybe we can have a combined Clubhouse, Mind and Meets Hindu History. We can talk about that and it'll be terrific.
Yeah, I would love that. I just hosted my first one the other day, and I think it was it was a great success, and I think it's a great format too. You know, this like conversational format with Q&A. It's really a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I hosted my first Clubhouse a few hours before we recorded. So yeah, we we both are are wetting our feet in, and let's see. So no, definitely do read out Jeffrey Long's book. My recommendation is going to be a very interesting one. So my recommendation is going to be read a historical book. I think Vivek Debaroi has written a fantastic interpretation of the Mahabharata. Read Vivek's books. Also, you have to read books that you disagree with as well, to sharpen your sort of knives. So I mean, it's a wrong metaphor, but basically sharpen your brains to counter the perspective of a lot of things that have been said and so forth. And I would also recommend reading Vishwa Professor. He has had some fantastic.
Yeah, they're great.
David Frawley has written some terrific books as well. And I'm hoping that in the near future, there is probably a Netflix series or an Amazon Prime series that encompasses all this and sort of talks about it. And maybe that day, and if there is one that exists, please write to us about it. Maybe we don't know about it, and we would love to watch it. And Vishal, maybe why don't we do this in a few weeks or months or something? We can do a live session with subscribers who are having questions, because I'm sure once we're done with this, there's going to be a million questions for you.
I'd love that. I'd be honored.
Yeah, but thank you so much, Vishal, for joining. You're doing great work, and kudos to you and all the best. And do please check out Hindu History and let him know what more he can do, what he should do for that. Thank you so much for joining us on Mindmakers.
Thank you, Aadit. I really appreciate you inviting me. I had a great time. You asked great questions. This was a really enjoyable conversation.
Awesome. Guys, please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, subscribe on YouTube. I do this a million times a week, every podcast, so please don't make me repeat. Jaake kar do. Hit like on this video, guys, and do comment below. Thank you so much, and we'll be back next week with more. This is a wrap.